Welcome. My name is James Hiscox. My guest today is Neil Boswell. So I thank you for joining us for this video. So how are you today, Neil?
I'm doing well,
Excellent. So I've invited Neil on here today to discuss a book he's written and kind of published online called The Perennial Gospel. It was originally titled The Amen Creed. Neil also runs a blog over at, what's the address again?
It's mythicism.net.
Okay, he runs a blog where he gives short, kind of too long didn't read versions of what's in his book. I think I'd describe that as. Do you think that's fair?
That is fair.
Okay, so if anyone, I'm guessing many of my viewers won't be familiar with his work already. So I'll just give you a brief introduction to why I have Neil on here. Neil is what I would refer to as a lay scholar. He's a layman without the formal qualifications of a doctorate, but he certainly has the understanding and the knowledge of a scholar. And the work that he does is simultaneously written to scholarly academic standards, but also written heavily in satire to kind of make it a bit more fun, a little less heavy, a little more digestible at the same time. He's got a unique writing style in this way, in that he will cover every base and leave no stone unturned, but simultaneously try and make it fun at the same time. That's a unique skill. It's like a storytelling skill that he seems to have. And aside from the actual storytelling side of things, the actual content itself is quite extraordinary. He seems to have made himself an expert in a little subgenre of a field that no one else seems to have gone into in the same way. So why are we here? What are we going to be talking about? So the question of how did Christianity begin? Was there a historical man named Jesus Christ is something that interests many of us. Many of us have a religious upbringing, or we just have an interest in how religion affects society and life at large. And the questions of religion are some of the big questions in life as a whole. So this is a question that does have significance. And one of the little, well, before I say that, there's three, to be general, there's three general perspectives on who Jesus was. I think it's fair to say that one position is the traditional Christian view that there was this man named Jesus Christ who was divine, who was God, and that the things written in the Gospels in the Bible are historically literally true. And then the second view is the kind of watered down, kind of mainstream view that there was a historical man named Jesus Christ, but he didn't do all these amazing things. And then the third view is that the stories are largely or entirely mythical. They're just stories. As part of that third view, many people have raised parallels between the stories of Jesus and stories of other God-men, particularly those that predate Christianity. Now, this is a subject we can call pagan parallels, a little subtopic of the overall topic. And this is something that my guest here, Neil, is a specialist in. I would even go as far to say he might even be the world's leading expert on this topic, despite not being recognized as such at this point in time. I would hope that it's only a matter of time until his work receives the recognition that it deserves. I think those of you that will take the time to look at his book and his blog will see the immense amount of research that has gone into it, and the immense amount of thought and planning that he's put into really constructing his arguments and just building the work. So having said all that, I'd like to let him speak for himself a bit. So Neil, in your own words, let's start with like a 5-minute introduction. If somebody had never heard of your work before and you wanted to give them like a 5-minute brief but concise introduction to the Perennial Gospel, what would you say to them?
I would say the blog and the book are, yes, about the pagan parallel thesis and is primarily focused on providing the primary sources that predate Christianity that opponents of this worldview always ask for, and that it seems most of the proponents of this worldview lack the knowledge of.
Yes.
So, my passion for this blog and for the book was to simply get the information out there.
Yeah. Yeah. So it seems that the information you presented in your book is largely unknown to the vast majority of people talking about these subjects.
Indeed. Yeah, that was my largest motivation to put all of these sources into one place to go to, like a blog or a book, because I had been in so many long, drawn out, seemingly endless discussions with people online about this topic, trying to answer all their questions and all their demands for primary source evidence. And then when I would present the evidence, they want to dispute the date of it. And then when I, present, certified scholarly opinions on the dates, it just, the goalpost keeps getting moved and getting moved. And it was getting exhausting, honestly. So I just needed one place on the internet that myself or anyone else could just point to and say, here, read this.
That's
that way I
right.
didn't have
That's
to keep
right.
repeating the same things over and over again.
That's right. I think in this day and age, everyone expects to be able to do a Google search and put in words Jesus, Osiris, hit click on Google, and expect it to come up right at the very top of the search list. But that's not the way it works. That's not how real research is done. I mean, the internet is an amazing tool, but it's also the world's biggest garbage pit. And everyone gets to have an opinion. And I mean, there's a good side to that, because it means people like yourself that aren't recognized as academics, but actually know what they're talking about, get to put their work out there. But on the other hand, everyone gets to do that. Every Joe blog, and everyone has an opinion. There's a saying about that. I'm sure you're familiar with it. Everyone has one. And look, let's face it, human beings as a whole, we're not so self-aware that we recognize the difference between our own opinions that may not have been thought out and planned, and those of other people that have really invested their time into something.
Agreed. Yeah. Let me get my words together here.
So the Amen Creed, what is the Amen Creed? What are the parallels between Osiris and Jesus? And I should let our viewers know here that the Amen Creed, so the Perennial Gospel, as you named it, it isn't just about Osiris. It's also about a whole host of other gods in the Hellenistic world, the Greek-speaking world, leading up to the time of Christianity, that were influenced by Osiris, because Osiris, he was like the great grandfather or patriarch of a long dynasty, of a long family of deities that basically copied him or took on his attributes.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a fair way to sum it up. There might have been, gods or mythological characters that predate Osiris that include a lot of these mythological motifs, but they've been lost to history. As far as I can see, Osiris is the earliest character we still have on the historical record that displays all of these attributes that are like the main bullet point tenets of Christianity and the gospel story.
Yes.
Again, in a more generic sense, each one of these, because that should probably be emphasized here as well, because that often becomes a point of contention with opponents of this view, is that we're not saying that each one of these gods and characters have a carbon copy stories of each other, and it's just, the names and dates have been changed to protect the innocent. Each one of them has been appropriated to their specific culture that the myth takes place. Hence, like, you have Osiris in Egypt, and then the Greeks even admit this. They modeled their cult of Dionysus around Osiris out of Egypt. So naturally, the cult of Dionysus is going to come with a very Greek flavor. And a lot of these motifs that symbolize the same things in the Osiris cult won't have the exact same forms, but it's still performing the same function within the mythos. Correct. And so I think that point should be emphasized. We're not saying that these are all carbon copies of each other. And in some cases, they aren't even deliberately copies of each other. Sometimes it just happens organically. People might, it's just in the cultural milieu, just like happens today with fictional stories that often have a lot of parallels, like between, say, Marvel comics and DC comics,
Yes,
it's just in the cultural milieu. But yeah, I think as far as we can reliably date it within the historical record, Osiris is the earliest character we have. And even he is largely based on an even older source, which is the crop cycles of nature and the stars and the moon.
yes,
Ultimately, all these major tenets that I guess you could say represent this monomyth, to borrow a term from Joseph Campbell, this monomyth that we can see reflected in the cult of Osiris, Dionysus of Greece, Attis of Anatolia, Adonis of Syria, and then, Jesus Christ of Palestine, and so forth. Those major tenets, and they're not canonized, I'm just referring to a very generic list of traits here, but all of those traits seem to correlate with some sort of symbolizing of astrological and nature phenomenon.
yes.
In particular, the seasons, the cycle of the seasons.
Yeah, and you can also take the death and resurrection and ascension into a spiritual perspective. You can say it's the death of the ego and the rebirth as a divine self, and ascension into higher consciousness, and you can make that analogy as well there. So like with Dionysus, for example, it's a good point of view to make. It seems possible that Dionysus as an indigenous Greek figure may have originally had nothing to do with Osiris, and then because I think for a while the borders to Egypt were closed, right? And then the borders were reopened, right? There's stories about
at some point throughout their history,
yeah.
Things like that took place. Go ahead.
Yeah, for example, like Dionysus may have simply been an indigenous Greek god of wine, and then at some point the influence of the Egyptian religion came in, and then all the Assyrian elements were added onto that as well. So Dionysus may have started off as a figure that had nothing to do with Osiris, or just general basic things, that were in common with all kind of mythos. And then at some point, all that Assyrian influence came in and completely changed the cult and redirected it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's exactly the case, because we can find references to Dionysus that are pre-Homeric within Greek sources, but the actual traits that we're talking about here within this monomyth pattern, those don't start showing up in association with Dionysus until about the 4th century BC.
Yes.
So
yes.
That's significantly after Homer.
Yeah, that's right. So I think that same kind of thing probably happened with a lot of these Hellenistic gods, in that there was an indigenous figure or indigenous religion that had a certain flavor that was in some ways generically similar to other religions, but distinct in itself. And then at some point that Assyrian influence came in directly, and it changed its course, so forth.
Right. I absolutely agree. And I think when you bring up, Dionysus being just this generic god of wine, I think that is the point of contention, because one of Osiris's major roles in Egypt that's often underemphasized to, Westerners who have an interest in this stuff, is that Osiris was basically the Egyptian god of wine, although we know him to be the god of other things, such as the god of the dead and the god of the crop cycles and of beer and grain crops and so forth. He was also the god of wine.
Okay. Well, that's the thing. If you're going to have a whole kind of pantheon of deities, each one having specific roles, these things are going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that was the point of entry for these Osirian traits to start to infiltrate the cult of Dionysus, is that they both happen to be gods of wine in their respective cultures.
Okay. Well, I'm loving the way this interview is kind of organically taking its own turn. I've got a series of notes here. I'm going to try and direct some questions at you. So, this idea of pagan parallels, finding things that are common between pre-Christian religions and Christianity. So the assumption, or the most obvious most obvious conclusion we can draw from these, if they are legitimate, is that Christianity took influence from pre-existing religions, and therefore these elements of Christianity aren't literally historically true, but they're basically part of a larger mythos. So this pagan parallel theory is not exclusive to the mythicist view of Jesus. It is also compatible with a kind of like a historicized kind of man, like a partially historical view as well. So there could have been, if we leave aside all the ins and outs of the actual question of the historicity of Jesus, is really not exactly the same as pagan parallels. They are, pagan parallels is like a subtopic of the overall subject, right? So they, you know, right, without looking at all that other evidence like Josephus and stuff like that, we could say there could have been a historical figure called Jesus Christ, who had followers and taught and so forth. And then after his death, all these other mythological elements were added to the story about him and so forth. So what we're talking about here is pagan parallels isn't just exclusively the domain of mysticism. It is compatible with the more mainstream view as well. Yes? What do you think?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. You don't have to be a mythicist to ascribe to the pagan parallel thesis. It's just as likely that these motifs were simply attributed to a singular human being who maybe has some root in, may have actually, you know, had its basis in a person who actually historically lived. We see that happen all throughout history, where when, you know, a human being is exceptional and accomplishes exceptional things in their lifetime, their legend grows after their death and gets accumulated with a lot of fictional elements. I mean, we can even see that within more recent memory, people who we know and can verify for a fact historically lived, but fictional elements are starting to be added to their bio. Take here in America, for example, Abraham Lincoln. And then, you know, 100 years later, we get movies like Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter. You know, none of that stuff happened in his, you know, time. But that goes to show the point that historical people who actually lived can have fictional elements added to their legend over time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but generally, pagan parallels is discussed more amongst mythicists. So the mainstream historicists, they seem to be okay about recognizing the virgin birth idea as being part of a larger mythos, but they really are hesitant to acknowledge the death and resurrection as being part of a wider mythos. So it seems that there's this open, like I remember reading Bart Ehrman. I read his book, the one that him and Carrier had a big back and forth about. And he was quite happy to recognize that the virgin birth stories, you know, were just part one of many dozens and dozens of similar accounts in the ancient world. But he was, you know, he would not at all recognize any relationship between the death and resurrection stories in the Gospels, between those of pre-existing mythos. So there seems to be a dichotomy there.
Definitely. I do think that's kind of odd because there's so many more occurrences of these mythological figures having either physical resurrections or some form of return after death. That's much more widely attested than stories of virgin births or sexless conceptions. You find a lot fewer instances of those and a lot more instances of these characters coming back from death.
Okay.
So to dispute the resurrection seems a little odd to me.
Yeah, it's very strange. It's very strange. We'll come back to the question of bias and stuff a little bit later. So mostly the people that are talking about pagan parallels are mythicists. And there's a handful of people who have formal academic qualifications. So that would be Richard Carrier, Robert Price. And then we have a few other people that are not necessarily formally recognized, but they have a bit more respect in their field, like Earl Doherty. And we have Neil Godfrey, I think he runs the Verito the Block. He's quite well known and respected. And then we have a few.
Right, the younger guy, like Lataster, I think his name, right?
Yeah. So he's academically qualified yet. He's what's his first name again?
I think it's Raphael.
Yeah, that's it. Raphael. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Thank you for remembering that. I think he's in Sydney, actually. So he's formally qualified, I believe. So he's kind of maybe following in Richard Carrier's kind of ideal. But then aside from those writers, we then have amateurs, basically hobbyists, people who don't have formal qualifications, who are just doing it because they're interested in it. And then we have a pretty wide variety, a wide divergence of quality in the amateur field. So we have people like yourself that actually have done serious academic research and have really made a serious attempt at meeting academic standards. And then we have, I guess, what people call the crackpots, like the Roman theory, the idea that it was all made up in the 4th century and all the pre-4th century evidence was fabricated in the 4th century by the Romans to make it look like this development. To me, that is really pushing it too far. And then we have a lot of people in the middle, people like Dorothy Murdoch, who's no longer with us. And we have Kenneth Humphreys, who had the Jesus Never Existed website, which was actually my introduction to the theory. And I find amongst, and we have Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy. They did
and that was my introduction.
Yeah. That was one of the first books I read on the subject. And amongst these writers, the academics tend to rip them to shreds. I think Richard Carrier absolutely detests that book, The Jesus Mysteries. I think he absolutely, he can't stand it. And Dorothy Murdoch doesn't receive much love from certainly doesn't get a very good response from historicists, whether they be Christians or secular. But I think amongst the amateurs, the hobbyists, there's a mixture. There's some really interesting, legitimate points made there, and there's a lot of mistakes made as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a double-edged sword. We have to thank, the academic process for providing us, the framework within which to approach these subjects and to do our research, to to have the boundaries within to operate, to have a good skeptical mindset, and how to apply critical thinking skills and so forth. And so yeah, we're much indebted to the academic system for those kind of things. But at the same time, I think what lay researchers like myself have to offer is that we also aren't burdened by the constraints of that system, which often involves a lot of politicking and so forth.
Excellent.
These people, this is where they butter their bread. So there is some bias at play, no matter how much they may try to deny it. I think these people have to secure their jobs, and I can't blame them for that. We all have our ways that we do that with our jobs, but I do think I think both sides have something to offer to the conversation, is what I'm saying.
I agree completely, absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely value in the academic world. There's definitely worth in having formal standards, having rules and regulations, and having a system to go through these things. But there's, at the same time, human beings are human beings, and we're all subject to bias. Human thought goes in trends, and the trends don't always develop in a forwards direction. They can go forward, they can go backwards, they can go to the side, they can go on tangents. So human evolution isn't always in a straight line forward. We're much more complicated creatures than that. We're far less rational and reasonable than we think we are. We're far more emotional. We identify with particular belief systems, and then we stick to them, and we insist on when we hear new information, we try to answer it from our fixed position, rather than listening and thinking, is there something of value here for me to learn? Is there more for me to learn? This is something that's relevant to every subject of humanity, like every topic that there is. These are basic core things that come down to who we are as human beings, what we are as consciousness, what we are as egos. So this is something that affects literally every subject that there is. There isn't any topic that is free from this kind of egoic dilution. So as you said, it's important to kind of be able to hold them accountable and have people outside their field that can come and say, hang on a second, you're doing you know, you've got some great standards and rules and you're doing some good work here, but there's a lot of stuff that you're missing because you're all thinking the same way, and you've got a group thing going on. You need people outside the community to come in and look at things from a different perspective sometimes.
Exactly. And that reminds me of, like, that's one of the reasons why I took the approach with the Perennial Gospel that I did. Because even though I'm a lay person, I wanted the primary sources to be there and available for other lay researchers and even academic scholars, if they happen to come across my works, to be able to access the primary sources directly, to be able to quote them and get the find actual links that provide these sources that they can go to and see for themselves and validate that these things are in fact true, or not, internet fabrications. Because for all the great things that, like, say, freaking Gandhi did, or that Dorothy Murdoch did with their work, when you read over their books, it's a lot of citations referencing the primary sources, but not as many direct quotations or presentations of pictures of the evidence and so forth. And I get that. I get why they would do that to, one, for, that they're bound, since their works are actually published, unlike mine, they're bound by certain, copyright laws and whatnot. But also, they have to constrain space, because publisher's not going to publish a book that's like 1,200 pages. They've got to narrow these things down, so they can't actually fit all the actual primary sources into their books. So I get why they had to do that, but I think that is one of the reasons why academic scholars try to avoid quoting people like Ms. Murdoch or freaking Gandhi. Because they don't want that citation to appear in their article saying, footnote DN Murdoch, Christ in Egypt, page 12. They don't want to put that in their book because their peers will have something to say about it. However, in the case of my works, they don't have to quote me. I'm a nobody. The primary sources are posted there for all to see and to cut and paste if they want to, right there on my website or in my book. And that has happened. I've actually looked around on the internet a couple of times and found certain doctoral dissertations for seminaries and stuff like that, where dudes have quoted some of the primary sources that are on my blog and only found on my blog and nowhere else.
Excellent. Well, that's really promising. That really shows at the beginning of the recognition of your work. And what you're saying there leads into the next point I had to ask you about. So let's talk about the Zeitgeist movie, the first one, and Dorothy Murdoch. So many people watched that Zeitgeist movie as a conspiracy kind of doco, 3 different parts. The first part of it, I think it was, featured a very brief kind of cartoonized version of Dorothy Murdoch's thesis that Jesus Christ was largely a representation of the cycles of the sun. So Murdoch's work, it's fair to say it improved significantly over her career. Like, if you look at Christ in Egypt, her last work on the subject, compared to her earlier work, it was much, much better. And if you look at the references at the end of that, she was making an attempt to lead people towards the actual evidence rather than making claims without any foundation for them. But she still, as you said, didn't cite the primary sources. She said, scholars have discovered this or have talked about this, but she didn't actually lead people directly to the primary sources. But Zeitgeist is obviously doesn't have a fantastic reputation. So I want to ask you, how do you feel about the Zeitgeist representation? What did it get right? What did it get wrong? And Dorothy Murdoch, what does she get right? What does she get wrong? How would you do it differently? Aside from what you have.
How would I do it? Right. I think with Zeitgeist in particular, it seemed to be relying very heavily on the works of Jordan Maxwell and Gerald Massey. I think we can be indebted to Zeitgeist for putting the pagan parallel thesis out there into the mainstream on a scale that we had never seen before up to that point. And for that, we can be very appreciative. It just happened to be the right timing. It came in right as, streaming social media started to blow up. YouTube finally started to blow up into a mainstream phenomenon. And it was just, a perfect storm of the convergence of factors to get it out there into the public eye. However, Honestly, I think its net effect has been more harm than good for the pagan parallel thesis and mythicism in general because of the degree of mistakes they made, because they actually just basically cut and paste from Gerald Massey and Jordan Maxwell, neither of whom I think are especially Jordan Maxwell is not even a credible thinker, let alone a credible scholar. He's not a scholar at all. He's just a conspiracy theorist. But even Gerald Massey, for as competent of a lay scholar he was for his time, also has his issues in his work where he overstates things. You know, he asserts similarities where I think there's just a vague similarity, and he asserts, you know, direct influence. And I think a lot of his stuff is very high context because he was sort of writing to other educated persons and other academic scholars and so forth, that a lot of his work often takes for granted that his readers will be familiar with the sources that he's referencing. And so he doesn't actually directly quote these primary sources, or if he makes passing references to something that sounds like it would be an amazing source if you could get a hold of it, when you try to track down the book from which he quotes it, the book no longer exists. It's out of publication. There's no physical copies left. And so it gets very frustrating trying to source all of Massey's claims.
Yeah.
And I think that created part of the problem that we saw in Zeitgeist. They just like kind of took Massey at his word, cut and pasted a lot of his claims onto their graphics, and never second guessed it. But of course, when a lot of the Christian viewers saw that movie, they had some things to say about it. So.
I did. Yeah, very well said. Very well said. And for our viewers, I think it's really significant that you yourself were pointing out that Massey and Maxwell were overstating things, because you're somebody that not just has provided primary evidence for the main parallels of like death and resurrection and the other things that went along with the mystery religions, like the sacramental meal and stuff like that, and baptism and stuff. But you also have gone down the routes of secondary parallels as well, and found a huge amount of secondary parallels with significant amounts of primary source evidence for them. So for you, as someone that's not just pushing the main ones, but the secondary parallels, to point out that these previous writers were parallel maniacs, you know, they were seeing things everywhere. It's quite significant. The distinction between doing things correctly and doing things wrong. And so I love the way you introduced that you know, Zeitgeist introduced this pagan parallel theory to the world in a new way, and it came together, as you said, when YouTube was just coming out or becoming more well known. But it definitely did as much harm as good in terms of getting it out there, because it did such a bad job of it. And it's given people, I guess, ammunition to just dismiss this whole field as being nonsense.
Right, and that's tragic. And I think when you had mentioned earlier, when you can see the evolution of Murdoch's work over the course of her career, you really see her start to take a turn towards being more seriously academic and holding up scholarly standards after Zeitgeist. Because before Zeitgeist, she was spearheading a movement, basically, at least on the internet, and at least here in the West and America and whatnot. She was spearheading whatever movement there might have been about the pagan parallel thesis and mythicism that there was at the time. And so naturally, when Zeitgeist took off, she got thrown in to that mix, and she received a lot of heavy fire and a lot of criticism for claims made in her past works. So she had to really go back and revise a lot of her past works and her past claims. And so I guess that's one of the positive effects of Zeitgeist, in that it got actual competent people like Murdoch to significantly improve her work. And I think that was part of her motivation, was like what I just said, were places where Zeitgeist and the sources that Zeitgeist is quoting, such as Massey or Maxwell, where they fail to leave a proper trail of breadcrumbs to the actual source of their claim. I think Murdoch was trying to fill in that gap. Like, oh, you guys are looking for, when Zeitgeist said this, you're looking for where they got the source for that. Well, here's the source for that.
Yeah. Okay.
And my criticism of Murdoch's work, if I have any to say, because I'm very greatly indebted to Murdoch. You know, she's been the singular biggest influence on my own works.
Yeah, I'll that.
Yeah. But where I would have a criticism of her work, especially like in Christ in Egypt, is I think she was relying a little too heavily on syncretism. There would be a lot of times where she would be talking about Horus, and she would be trying to defend where, a parallel supposedly exists within the mythos of Horus and the mythos of Jesus. Like, say, for instance, we're talking about the virgin birth. I remember there being large sections in her section about, in her part of the book where she talks about Horus's virgin birth, where she instead appealed to Greek gods such as Ion and Poros, or Pora, or whatever her name was, like these counterparts to Persephone and other Greek gods. These are like the Roman names for these Greek gods. But there are writers of the early centuries of the Common Era who did, make these syncretistic ties between, say, Horus and Ion. But she would take that one piece of syncretism and really run wild with it. She would say, okay, we can find sources for all these traits for the god Ion. And since this author says that Horus is the same as Ion, therefore Horus.
Yeah.
And it's like, I get that, and that is technically true, but that's not going to be persuasive to her critics,
Yeah. Okay. Well, this kind of leads back into what we started talking before. So the reason, as I said, reason why I have you here is to, talk about your book. So the Perennial Gospel is really an extraordinary work. So I became aware of what you were doing quite a long time before your book came out. We crossed paths on the internet, and I became aware of what you were compiling and the standard of your work. And so I had the great pleasure of viewing it before it became public. It really is groundbreaking on so many levels. It's raised the bar so far beyond what anybody has ever done before, I think, in this field. Even the professionals, Richard Carrier and Robert Price and Doherty and so forth, they're very, very good at what they do. They're very, very intelligent. So I'm not meaning to put down their work at all. They've done an exceptionally good job at what they do. And they've tried for an overall consideration of the subject of Christian origins, and was is Jesus Christ a historical figure? You've really honed in on pagan parallels, specifically on the Egyptian influence and the kind of the patriarchy of Osiris and his influence on all these other deities and all these other cults. And the way you've just raised the bar, and you've gone into such a level of depth and understanding. Some of these artifacts that you've come up with, they're extraordinary in their significance, and no one else is talking about them. Some of these parallels that you found are exceptional and really, really vitally important. So I guess I say to people, and one of the approaches I take is, it's not just how much you read, it's what you read. And if people haven't heard of your book, then you can't blame them for not being aware of this stuff. But your work really deserves recognition, because the evidence in there is so compelling, so important for the subject. It has to be considered. You can't really claim to have a complete understanding of this subject unless you're aware of this evidence. It's so important. So what do I want to ask you? So tell people about the parallels between Osiris and Jesus. I'd like you to just talk us through the Assyrian cult, its features, its development. You can talk us through how it has influenced the mystery religions, the various Hellenistic cults, the main features of those, and how they influence Christianity, and basically talk through the main parallels between Christianity and the Assyrian cult and its children, you could say. So let's hand it over to you, and this is kind of the main bulk of what I wanted to do here today with the interview, is really talk about your book in depth. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I guess the largest bulk of the evidence that is presented in the book are direct citations from the complete corpus of funerary texts out of Egypt, divided into three big categories, those being, of course, the pyramid texts from the Old Kingdom, the coffin texts from the Middle Kingdom era, and the Book of the Dead from the New Kingdom and the Greek era. and so forth. And since those were not an electronic version of those that would be word searchable, like as you mentioned at the beginning of this interview, everybody today wants to be able to Google everything, and like, you know, they want fast food research is what they want, you know. That didn't really exist for this corpus of text. You know, finding an English translation that was affordable was hard enough, and then if you could find one, it's always, you know, in print. They, at least at the time that I was writing this book, they weren't available in an electronic format, especially not one that was word searchable, so that people could go directly to, you know, the one or two lines that were relevant to demonstrating a parallel between Osiris and Christ. So basically that's what it took, was me going through line by line and reading each one of these long corpuses of funerary texts line by line. And then when I saw something that said like, yes, Osiris bodily rose from the dead, and then another passage that says, yes, he rose from the dead after 3 days, and then being able to, like, you know, pin that down and put that into the book. All right, if you want to find where Osiris rose after 3 days, go to this verse of the pyramid text as translated by Raymond Faulkner. So that's the major crux of the evidence that's presented in the book. But as you said, there's also a lot of other things. I try to include a lot of pictures and illustrations of archaeological evidence and so forth that also demonstrates these parallels. But basically, when you ask for like, what are the parallels between Osiris and Christ, that's where I think you could take the bullet point list that Zeitgeist used in a lot of the graphics. I'm sure we're all familiar with it because there are condensed versions all over the internet, all over YouTube, where it's just that like 3-minute clip of Zeitgeist saying, Horus out of Egypt was born of a virgin, you know, on December 25th, he rose from the dead, blah, blah, blah. And it's like they did this for each one of like the mystery school gods. Obviously, you know, those lists get some things right and some things wrong. But the one god that's missing from that list is the one god that I think is the most legitimate for these claims, which is Osiris himself, Horus's father, ironically. I think they could have dismissed all the other gods that were in their little list there and stuck just to Osiris, and they probably would have been good, actually, because most of those claims that I've seen for Osiris paralleling Christ, I've been able to validate from Egyptian primary sources. For instance, although this would be the first parallel on the list, but it's not actually validated in any Egyptian sources, it's validated in a Greek source, is the virgin birth of Osiris, which is actually, I gotta reference my own work here because it's been so long since I wrote the book, but Theophrastus, it was a Greek source called Theophrastus, who actually, as far as I'm aware, he was writing in around the 4th or 3rd century BCE, and he, in a passage in his work where he's actually talking about animals that are virgin-born, they can reproduce through parthenogenesis, he very quickly mentions that humans are one of those animals that sometimes can give birth to virgin-born offspring. And then right after that, he lists as an example, he says, in Egypt, the so-called Osiris is produced without intercourse.
Wow.
And this is like 3 or 4 centuries before the gospel and before Christ. So that's one right there. And you can't get much more overt than that, because when you try to bring up, say, evidence that maybe Dionysus or one of these other characters was virgin born or had some sort of parthenogenesis, non-sexual conception and birth, like, people will fight you tooth and nail over every bit of terminology that's in the source you're trying to present to them. But this quote from Theophrastus, I think, is pretty straightforward. Osiris is produced without intercourse. It's pretty overt. And these are the kinds of things I try to highlight in the book. But you go down the list of any of the major attributes of Christ, you can find pretty much all of them in the cult of Osiris, somewhere in the vast corpus of funerary literature that makes reference to him. Like this idea that, what else do we have? Again, like I said, the death and resurrection, the physical, bodily
this
death
is the
and
main
resurrection.
One. I mean, death and resurrection is really the crux of the matter. It's the thing that Christians say is the unique and you know, the unique belief of their faith, the tenet of their faith. It's the primary element of their faith. It's really the thing that everything else is built from. So this is the thing that matters the most: death and resurrection.
Absolutely. And what you just, go ahead.
Yeah, and this is a significant amount of your work is based on that subject for that reason.
Absolutely, because what you just said about that being the main tenet of Christianity, the same could be said of the cult of Osiris. Exactly. If you were to strip away all the other qualities of Osiris and say, Osiris, this defines Osiris right here as a god of Egypt, He is the God of death and resurrection.
Exactly.
And that was the main appeal of his cult, was that it promised his followers eternal life through the form of physical resurrection and departure to the underworld.
Yes.
And yeah, I would go so far as to say myself, based on what I've read out of all of the Egyptian literature that I've had access to, that is the most widely attested mythological motif in all of ancient Egyptian culture, is the death and resurrection of Osiris. Like, that is his defining trait, if nothing else.
Yeah, and that's
and
the
this
primary.
This is a test.
I was just going to say, it's a primary trait that was transferred to all the other gods that was syncretic of Osiris. So if you look at, Dionysus and Orpheus and Attis, Adonis, there are significant differences in the way death and resurrection is portrayed. It's not always simply a physical human being being physically killed and then bodily coming back to life on earth. Sometimes it's a descent in the underworld and a return to the land of the living. Sometimes it's an ascension into heaven and deification. Sometimes it's death and then being reborn, literally being born again in the case of Dionysus and so forth. But they're all clearly part of the same mythos. And so critics like to really split hairs on this. But what you've uncovered is that there are enough common direct examples of physical bodily death and resurrection on earth in these stories, as well as all the other variations which are still part of the same mythos.
Absolutely. Yeah, it doesn't get more overt than in these quotes from the pyramid texts and these other funerary corpuses from ancient Egypt. I mean, there's really, in my opinion, no disputing that Osiris had a physical bodily death and resurrection in the same body that died and was buried.
Yeah.
No matter how many hairs the apologists and skeptics and cynics want to try to split over the situation with Osiris, I think it's so widely attested, and the statements are so overtly referring to bodily resurrection, and that there's no disputing it, and it's laughable to me that anyone would even try to dispute it. And when they do dispute it, to me, that just verifies that they are ignorant of these sources.
Yeah.
When they say outright, you will have power again in your body will rise up, your muscles will function again, blood will flow into your muscles again, and you will walk upon your feet again. I mean, this is very blatant language referring to a physical bodily resurrection.
It's absolutely explicit. It's not referring to a spiritual immortality of the soul, which the Greek writers reference later on, but it was clearly referring to a physical resurrection. And obviously, you can make the case that, ask anybody on the street, what do they know about ancient Egypt? They'll talk about pyramids and mummies, right? You can basically make the case that the whole point of mummification and building the pyramids, the primary point of it was because of this physical resurrection belief in the Assyrian cult. They took it so seriously. They went to great lengths to make this happen, or because of this belief. They went to great lengths because of this ideology. So to deny that they believed in physical bodily resurrection is absurd. It's so well, as you said, it's so well attested. It's written all over the walls of the pyramids. It's written on the coffins. It's attested by outside sources before Christianity. It's everywhere in the ancient world. There's so much evidence for it. And the other thing about your book, as well as citing the primary text, you cite directly from up-to-date academics. So every time you put forth a primary source, you then bring in conversation about it, the interpretation and discussion about it from current academics. I think that one of the criticisms given of like Gerald Massey and stuff like that is that they relied on out-of-date scholarship and things like that. But everything that you've done in your book was up to date at the time that you published it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, for instance, continuing to run with the theme of the physical resurrection, I mean, that's so widely attested that the majority of Egyptologists that I've encountered who speak on the matter also verify, like, no, Osiris actually had a bodily resurrection in the same body that died and was buried.
Yeah.
Like, no, like, as you just said, the point of mummification was to preserve your physical body for a physical resurrection. I mean, that is said outright by Eric Hornung, who for decades was the premier Egyptologist in the world. And
Yeah.
he says that outright in some of his books, like, no, the point of mummification was for physical resurrection.
Yep. So if Christianity had never existed, right, if it never came about, any modern examples of resurrection, belief in a resurrection and eternal life, you would just say, oh, that's just like Osiris, right? But because everyone knows Christianity, because Christianity became the world's biggest religion, these beliefs are associated with Christianity. So anybody now that comes up with a new ideology or a new story that has these features, they're going to say, oh, that's a lot like Christianity. But if Christianity had never existed, we'd all be saying the same thing, but about Osiris. And really, given the amount of evidence, we should be seeing Christianity then as one of many cults that was influenced by the grandfather deity Osiris.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why it's funny that you say that. That's why that's the first correlation made in movies that you can tell are overtly influenced by these myths, such as Christianity or even ancient Egypt, such as The Matrix.
Yeah.
You know, the Wachowskis admitted that all of these sources, not just Christianity and Judaism, but also Gnosticism, the cult of Mithras, there was Egyptian influence on the ideas they presented in The Matrix. And within the Matrix films, we know Neo has a death and resurrection scene, but also early on in the film, who's the one character they liken Neo to overtly? They say, "You're Jesus Christ. You're my savior, man."
Yeah.
So yeah, you hit it on the head right there. But again, the Wachowskis admitted it wasn't just Christianity. Egyptian and Greek ideas also influenced this film as well. So even if we didn't have Christianity to point to as a template for this monomyth in the Matrix, we could still say, well, they were influenced by Egypt as well.
Yeah. So I mean, death and resurrection is the main. It's kind of like the foundation of Orthodox Christianity, and along with that come a lot of other things, like believing that eating the bread and drinking the wine is eating the body of Christ, and drinking the wine is drinking the blood of Christ, and being saved through that. And then baptism, being reborn in Christ. There's a death and resurrection in the baptism. There's a lot of these kind of the same idea keeps on repeating itself over and over again. And then you have the eternal life after death. There's the physical death, and then there's the resurrection after you die in heaven. There's the eternal life there. So believing in death and resurrection as a means to eternal life, that's really the foundation of Christianity. And as you said, it's the foundation of the Assyrian cult. It's like the primary core of that cult. And this is the primary element that we see being borrowed by and just being taken on by later cults, particularly the Dionysus cult in Greece, and also the other mystery religions, the Eleusinian mysteries, with I don't know how to pronounce the names of the gods in the Eleusinian mysteries, Persephone or something like that.
Yeah, Persephone and Demeter.
That's the one. Yeah. And then there was the Orphic mysteries as well. And then there was mystery religions of Attis and Adonis, and then later Mithras as well. And all of these took that primary core, and they developed their own version of it. And there were significant differences in them. But it's very clear that they are continuing that line of influence. So there's really no question about that. And in regards to all these other Greek and Hellenistic cults, there's so much academic conversation about the syncretism there. There's so much ancient sources showing the merging of them together. So you have a lot of these artifacts that you've discussed in your book show composite gods like Osiris, Dionysus, or Attis and Adonis. So can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point too, because one point of contention with critics of the pagan parallel thesis is this idea, which I'm not entirely sure where it comes from. It has no basis, in my opinion, but this idea that Judaism and Christianity kind of evolved within its own bubble, that was immune to outside influence. And so even if with these particular critics who use this particular excuse I'm talking about, even if you can get them to admit that, yes, these parallels can be established in pre-Christian primary sources, and yes, the interpretation of this evidence as verifying these parallels, yes, that is established by modern scholarship. Yes, you can show them, Dr. Eric Hornung saying, yes, Osiris had a physical bodily resurrection and so forth. Even when you can get these critics to admit all of that, they will still try to say, well, that still didn't influence Christianity because for whatever reason it evolved in some kind of bubble and was not influenced by these other cultures. But yes, they were. These cultures were, they might have been physically far apart for the time when people, only got around by horseback and camelback. It might seem like a great distance, but no, like culture was very fluid at the time. People didn't have the internet back then, so that was how they entertained themselves, by talking and exchanging culture, exchanging ideas, and Palestine in particular was at a geographic location where it was at the center of several crossroads between the East and the West and North Africa. And so a lot of travelers with bringing their exotic foreign cultures came through Palestine. We know for a fact that missionaries from India brought Buddhism into Palestine and North Africa and Western Europe as early as the 3rd and 2nd century BCE. So even a culture as far away and as foreign as Buddhism had already, made its way that far west and was starting to have influence on the culture. So it's a bit naive to think these cultures were, separated and never the twain shall meet and didn't have any influence on each other. But getting back to your point of syncretism in particular, yes, this is a point that I was not aware of before I engaged in this research for writing the book. I wasn't aware to how deep the overt syncretism was with Palestinian deities and these, Greco-Roman and Egyptian deities and so forth, these pagan Gentile deities, you might say. There are several pre-Christian sources that attest to direct syncretism between Yahweh and Horus, or Elohim and Osiris, as well as Christ and Serapis, Dionysus and Elohim, Adonis and Adonai, and so forth. These are, and not just in Gentile sources. There are Judaistic sources that attest to this syncretism going on as well. So no. These things did not evolve in bubbles that were isolated from each other. They were heavily intermingled, and the influence went both ways. That I will give to Christians who try to bring that up. Well, how do you know it was the case that this influenced this? Maybe it was Christianity that influenced this cult. In some cases, on some points, that was actually the scenario. Yes, Christianity, the influence went both ways. Judaism and Christianity did also influence the cultures around it, but it was a two-way street. Christianity is also clearly heavily influenced by these outside cultures.
So the point you made about it doesn't seem to make any sense why academics will be so willing to acknowledge the overwhelming reality of syncretism in other cultures, but then they insist that it didn't happen in Judaism and Christianity. And that really comes, I think personally, it comes down to the fact that Orthodox conservative forms of Judaism and Christianity insist on their origins as being unique. They insist on their origins as being handed down by God. So if you look at pagan parallels in the Christian Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, mainstream academics, mainstream scholars are quite happy to recognize that that Judaism emerged organically out of the indigenous culture in Canaan, and that really none of it was unique. It was just as unique as any cult is, in that they emerged from the influences that are around them, and they develop their own flavor and they become unique in that respect. But the unique element perhaps is that the belief in exclusivity, the religious exclusivity, and the demands that they believe that their religion is distinct from other faiths. and that they draw this line and say our religion is divine and good, every other religion is evil, is false, and leads you to hell and suffering and so forth. And there are examples of exclusivity like that in other faiths, but they're far more direct in the Abrahamic faith. So the Abrahamic faith really insists on that, and it's far more emphasized in the Abrahamic faith, in the conservative forms of them. So a lot of mainstream academics, even if they're not Christian or they're not conservative Christians now, they were still raised within that culture. Their families, even if it's their grandparents, held these beliefs that Christianity was unique and distinct, and is different from all the pagan evil religions out there that will take you to hell, and that influences their thinking at a very, very young age, and it's still influencing their thinking now, even if they're not conservative Christians, they're not Christians at all, they might be atheists, they still seem to have some attachment to this belief in the uniqueness of Christianity.
There's definitely some double talk in that kind of perspective, because it's all unique. Each one of these cultures, if you line them up next to each other, here's Egypt, here's Greece, here's Rome, here's Palestine, they're all going to be just as different from the next, and nevertheless, like a lot of these cultures that were more influential at that time during the development of Christianity, such as Greek and Rome, like they bragged about how much their culture was influenced by older cultures such as Egypt. Right. They didn't try to say, "Oh no, we're exclusive. We got the copyright on this. We came up with this." They're like, "No, we got this from Egypt. They're much older and much wiser than us, and they passed that knowledge on down to us." So they actually bragged about having influence from earlier cultures, and to an extent, I guess you could say Christianity does as well, but only with Judaism and no other culture. So that is such a bizarre, backwards kind of way of thinking for the time.
I remember seeing those Greek sources where they say, no, our culture comes from Egypt. They're quite open about that, recognizing that, and you can see the reality of that in the Greek mystery religions being their version of the Assyrian cult. So there's clearly, they weren't just making that up. There was a direct line of influence there, and they were quite open about recognizing it. It was no secret really. And that's very interesting. It leads us back to if there's no secret that the Greeks took on death, resurrection, eternal life, sacramental meals, baptism, all the stuff from the Egyptians. Why is it so controversial to consider the Christians did the same thing, or the same core features that influenced so many cults leading up to Christianity? Why is it so controversial to say, okay, Christianity is one of many, many cults that were influenced by this big stream? It really was such a profound influence on so many cults in the ancient world.
To answer that question, in my particular opinion, I think that is largely centered around the divinity of Christ, in particular, the Christology specifically, like the way they put Jesus on a particular pedestal. They have to defend the fact that this fellow was unique, even granting that such a person existed historically, and not disputing no, he was completely fictional, that such a person really did exist. The way that the function that character plays within Christianity, they have to defend that uniqueness to make the character work for the function that he's assigned within their religion.
As we said, exactly. So one of the things that really astounded me in your book was, as I said before, not just primary evidence and conversations from academics about these main features of death and resurrection, which we could already find before your book. We could find evidence for that before your book. You've done an exceptional job of bringing all that together, but also secondary features of it. They're just so astonishing, like how significant the whole death and resurrection on a tree is to all these pre-Christian religions. It really is a primary feature of them as well. It's not just that it's a secondary thing or a coincidence. It really was a primary feature. I loved you showed these amulets that the Egyptians wore, and it was a jed ankh, and so it's literally a looped cross, a cross with a loop on the top, as a symbol of miraculous, magical, eternal life, and it has Osiris on the tree, in the jed pillar. So it's literally Osiris on a tree, on a cross, as a symbol of miraculous resurrection and eternal life. That's extraordinary. And they wore it around their necks, just like a Christian wearing a cross. That's extraordinary.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was kind of blown away by that too, and was kind of a little taken aback that no one else had noticed the resemblance there. Yeah, the jed in particular. The jed in itself makes a perfectly fine cross. It's one for the viewers who may not be aware. The jed was a symbol in ancient Egypt that was basically a cross, but instead of having one crossbar, it had four, and it was meant to symbolize the tree in which Osiris's corpse was placed after he was killed and buried. The myth goes that his brother Seth killed him, locked his corpse in a casket, dumped it in the Nile. It washed ashore and ended up tangled up in tree branches, and eventually the tree grew around the casket, encasing Osiris within the tree itself. And then to symbolize that tree symbolically, the Egyptians made a cross out of it. And then you can find a lot of iconography, which James has referenced, where it's a jed pillar, and you flip it over, and on the back is Osiris. So it's basically you have a cross affixed to the back of Osiris. And so that is also interesting. You might even say that's the earliest form of a crucifix, But yeah, it definitely gets really freaky and really overt when you see that as James has pointed out, the Egyptians combine these symbols of the jed, which represents the death of Osiris, with the ankh, which is another type of cross that represents eternal life. So hence this is like the merger of those two makes this tree or this cross represent the same thing in the cult of Osiris as it does in Christianity, which is the symbol of both death and eternal life. Salvation after death. And but visually, the visual appearance of like Osiris with a jed fixed to his back, and then onto the jed is affixed an ankh cross, really makes the whole thing look just like a Christian crucifix.
Yeah, it's absolutely extraordinary, so explicit, so direct. It's one of the things. So I said before that it's not so much how much you read, it's what you read. And so I present to my viewers and to anyone I talk about this subject, I say, you need to be aware of this evidence that you presented in your book to have an informed opinion on the subject. If you're disagreeing with these conclusions that we're putting forth about the pagan parallel theory, there's really three options. One, you're ignorant of the evidence and the arguments for them. Two, you're so biased that you're unwilling to take the evidence to its logical conclusion. Or three, you're lacking the capacity to understand the evidence. That's a polite way of putting it. And of processing it and understanding what it means and really just thinking through it all. So this is really astounding evidence that anyone that wants to have a valid opinion on the subject needs to be aware of. And if you consider there's 1 billion Christians on the planet, all of them need to be aware of this information. This is really significant stuff. They really should be made aware of this, and the fact that their apologists aren't telling them this stuff and are actively denying it is extraordinary. And it's like gaslighting and denial. I don't want to use the word conspiracy because it brings off so many. But yeah, you get what I'm saying here.
Yes. It takes work to satiate your curiosity if you're truly curious about answering the questions surrounding this particular topic. I mean, for persons like you and myself, we were Christians before we encountered the pagan parallel thesis, and the reason we have such a passion for this particular topic is because it made a significant contribution into our deconversions from Christianity. So I want the information to get out there. And excuse me for just a moment, I lost my train of thought. I was going to go somewhere with that.
Okay.
Give me just a second to compose my thoughts.
Well, look, we'll come back to talking about the book and the parallels and stuff more. But I think we started going into another little point, a question I was going to ask you that was on the list here. So let's lead in that, and I'll let you go with it. So I wanted to at some point talk about why is this important? What are the significance of this? Why do we do this? I think there's people tend to think that mythicists are people that hate Christians or are so angry with God and angry with Christianity. If I talk about myself, just for a moment, I'm somebody that had a Christian upbringing, and then I deconverted in a very non-rational kind of way. And then a few years later, then developed a real interest in understanding religion and spirituality, and kind of started this spiritual quest as an adult, not as somebody who was, born into religion, but as somebody that really genuinely wanted to find out about spirituality and religion. And certainly I will confess and admit that I did have a lot of pain regarding my religious upbringing. And in the past, there were times when I was very angry. Yes, that was true to some degree, but I've, really, I think that has healed. I've found extraordinary peace in my spiritual path. And I actually have I have a deep, profound respect for Christianity and Christians. I have an immense amount of common ground with them on so many levels. Many of my favorite people are Christians. Many of my best friends or favorite family members are Christians. I actually even on occasions go to Christian churches because I actually like the praise and worship, believe it or not. I love a lot of Christian music. I listen to a lot of it at home, actually, even though I'm not a Christian. So I find on a basic spiritual level and on a philosophical level and a cultural level, basic values, I have a lot of common ground with Christianity, and I don't think I'm at all angry with the religion. But having said all that, all the stuff still matters. This is important. So I think we can have very valid reasons for wanting to investigate this and talk about this, discuss this, and it has significant meaning and has real significance for so many subjects. So yeah, what do you want to have to say about that?
I think you make a good point there, and especially with the music, I often find myself getting nostalgic for the Christian music I listened to in my youth as well. This sort of ties into the point we were just trying to make earlier, which is you've got to put the work in to answer your your curiosity, your skepticism, your existential crisis when you're having doubts about your faith, your worldview. You've got to put the work in. Like you can't just wiki scholar this stuff. We don't have you can't have just fast food apologetics and only Google for the most simplistic immediately available answers and then just dismiss and be like, okay, well that's done, that's settled, and move on to the next thing. I think far too many people try to do that with their faith, and that's one of the frustrating things that we deal with when we encounter conversations about the Pagan parallel thesis online, is that it seems a lot of the critics and antagonists towards the thesis don't want to put in the work that it takes to answer the questions they have. As soon as the first answer pops up that satiates their particular bias, okay, good, that's done, that's settled, I don't want to hear about it anymore. And then frustratingly, it could be like pulling teeth trying to get them to come back to that question and re-examine the evidence that they might have missed. No, did you see this? Did you see this? Did you see how this all converges to make the point that this part of Christianity was influenced by this part of Egypt? You got to put in the work. You can't condense this stuff down into just a 2-page Wikipedia article. My book is over 900 pages. My blog has 20 articles on them, and each of them are 20 pages a piece when you click on them. So it's dense. It's a lot of dense material, and it's not for the intellectual lazy, so to speak. That might be a harsh way to phrase it, but
yeah, that's true. And it's just being authentic to want to know the truth about a subject. We're not doing this because we hate Christians or we're angry with Christianity. We're doing this because we have a genuine, authentic desire to know the truth. And for myself, I'm somebody that I believe in a supreme being. I can use the word God, and I am totally at peace with that word. If I refer to my belief in God, I'm not a Christian, so I don't believe in the Christian conception of God. But I'm very serious about my belief and my practice. I would say to people, if you truly believe in God, if you truly love God, if you truly want to serve God, then you owe it to yourself. It's your duty to research these subjects and to really think about them and to talk them through and to find out the truth. When people have a sincere faith in God, they tend to think it's their duty to defend particular beliefs. But I say no. It's actually it's your duty to find out what is true and what is real, to follow the evidence to its conclusion. Because one of the main mistakes that human beings make with spirituality and religion, is that they believe that if something is partially correct, they assume it must be completely correct. So if they pick up a spiritual book, a religious text, and they start reading it, and then all of a sudden this profound peace comes over them, they start seeing a light, and they feel different, and it changes their life, and they give up bad habits. They stop doing things that were bad for them. They become a kinder person, a better person, and their life improves. They think, well, this book is holy, is sacred, it must be true, literally, physically, absolutely true. And I'd say to them, it simply means that the divine found an opening there, found a way into you, found a way past your ego, and it found a way to begin an awakening process. It doesn't mean that everything in that book was absolutely true. We have the oversimplistic idea that, if God tells you to write a book, that everything that you're going to write is going to be divinely inspired and everything is going to be true. The reality is that you may have something to contribute to the world and to others to help them, but you're going to put a lot of yourself into that as well. And that's just the reality. It's going to come out as a mixture. So that's how I approach this subject. It matters significantly, and we have a duty to, even if you're not religious, if you're an atheist, you should care about the truth. You should care about what really happened. What matters? What's the evidence? What are the actual arguments for it?
Right, and that's an excellent point you just made, is being able to also separate the wheat from the chaff, to borrow an expression from Christianity. Yes. Which is to not blindly accept everything from something just because part of it is good, and correct, inversely not completely rejecting something just because you find one or two mistakes in it. Correct. There is value in all of it, and you've got to parse it out, because again, this isn't for the lazy. You got to put the work in, and you do have to parse it out. I think it's a natural desire for human beings, and perhaps just all living creatures in general, to try and to pursue the path of least resistance, to always pursue the most simple solution to your problems. That's just natural. That's understandable. But I think the drawback to that is when we want that to still be the case when we encounter complex subjects. Yes. And that there's no shortcut to a lot of these things.
Yes. I mean, I often say you can't be an expert on everything. No one has the time or the energy or the inspiration specifically to be an expert on everything. You'd have to have an infinite amount of time on your hands, an infinite amount of energy, and an infinite connection to the infinite to be inspired in that way. So we all do have to rely on experts. And this is where it comes down to, there is such a responsibility on people who are considered and accepted as experts to lead people in the right direction.
Yeah, 100% agreed. But as you said, we can't necessarily, you can't expect one person to be, thoroughly educated in all the relevant topics at hand, because there's just so much data out there now. I think the age of polymaths is probably over, because the body of human knowledge that we've accrued throughout our evolution is so vast now. No one person can be an expert in everything, and that's where I'll cut people like Barnum and so forth a lot of slack. Like, how could he possibly, this guy has spent his whole career pouring all that energy and time that he has into learning ancient Greek and so forth, and a lot of linguistics and and a lot of these skills that are above my pay grade. So how could he possibly have the time to sit down and read the pyramid text line by line and search for, the relevant passages about the Osirian religion? He doesn't have time for that. He's a much busier dude with much more important projects on his table. So I can understand why he's ignorant of a lot of this stuff. But as you said, if he's going to take up the mantle of being an educator, it would help if he was better informed about these things that he's speaking on.
Yeah, well, all what you just said leads into one of the points I wanted to make and a question I wanted to put to you. So why on earth haven't Egyptologists pipped in on this conversation yet, or have they tried to educate Christians and people like Bart Ehrman who are atheists but are educators and accepted as experts on the subject? Why did it take you as a layman, as a hobbyist, somebody with just a passion about this, to put all this evidence together, when there are people whose career, they're paid to do this, they're accredited, they're in universities, they're going to Egypt, they're doing they're digging stuff up, this is their life. Why haven't they put all this together, and why haven't they picked in, when you have people, you have the scholars on religion like J.Z. Smith, who tells you that Osiris wasn't resurrected? Why, why did Bart Ehrman go to J.Z. Smith and not to Egyptologists? It doesn't make any sense. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And that would go back to a point that we made earlier, that some of the constraints that come with operating within the academic system is, politicking and networking. These guys are peers, and they have to rely on each other for mutual research, mutual access to evidence, exchanging of pieces of evidence and information and whatnot. And so they rub elbows and they have to stay in good with each other. And I get that. But nevertheless, to answer your point in particular, why haven't the Egyptologists chimed in on this particular subject? The first point I want to make is I've noticed a few who have, and in my own observation, all the ones that do are not Westerners. They tend to be Middle Eastern scholars who actually lived and born and raised in Egypt and the surrounding countries as well there in the Near East, and don't come from a background of Christianity. They tend to be mostly of Muslim background. And so perhaps that's one contributing factor to why it's only that demographic of scholars who are chiming in on the subject, because they don't have the bias to have to defend Christianity and its uniqueness. And on that point, the other reason I would say why Egyptologists at large haven't chimed in on this subject is because I'm not sure it's necessarily relevant to their field. Because Christianity doesn't start to have a significant influence in Egypt until basically after the good old days are already over, and it's just a shell of its former self. The 3rd, 4th century CE is when we finally start to see Christianity take a firm hold within Egypt and have a significant influence on Egyptian culture and way of life. And by that point, the golden era of what we classically think of as Egypt is long over. So it's almost like it's entirely different Egypt by that point. And so, people who go into the field of Egyptology who have romanticized this idea of what Egypt is in their mind when they decide as a little boy or girl that they want to grow up to be an Egyptologist, that era of Egypt long predates Christianity.
Yeah.
And so I think the very question of was there a historical Jesus Christ is just irrelevant to their field.
Yeah. Okay. So that really leads into one of the main problems with the Western academic mind, the Western academic system, is being so compartmentalized. The Western mind likes to define everything and separate everything into little boxes and put them into thousands, millions, billions of different separate boxes, and never shall those boxes intermingle. And that doesn't really accurately represent the way that life is as a whole. What we call syncretism is simply the influence of culture on individuals and groups, and it's found in every single field of humanity. It's found in music, it's found in food, it's found in dance, it's found in architecture, found in art, in everything, literally everything, politics, anything you can name. There isn't a single heavy metal musician today that isn't influenced by Metallica, whether it be directly or indirectly. There isn't a single pop musician that isn't influenced by Michael Jackson or probably Madonna or the Beatles. Basically, anything that comes after such an influential group is going to be influenced by them, whether it be like Blur or Oasis that were directly influenced by them, or whether it be indirectly. It's just one of those things. And but the Western mind likes to define everything on such distinct boundaries and to make subcategories and subcategories and subcategories. So we're very reductionist, or the Western mind as a whole is reductionist. Personally, I've always been more of a general knowledge person. I'm an amateur philosopher. I have no formal academic qualifications. As you know, I don't have any PhD or doctorate on my name. I haven't, I started a psychology degree at university and dropped out. I had major personal issues at the time, and I wasn't mature enough or organized enough to be self-motivated and self-organized. So I'm completely self-educated, essentially, in this respect. So I've never been personally inclined to be reductionist, but it's certainly a major defining element of the Western mind. So as you said, different fields of academia, they don't cross-communicate, they don't intermingle. They have their own agenda, they have their own thing that they specialize in. But they don't all come together and share their knowledge and come up with a general knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a shame. Again, I think a large part of why they also don't chime in on this particular subject is because of the bad reputation the topic has gotten in the wake of the damage done by films like Zeitgeist or authors like Jordan Maxwell, because you can find passing references by some of these scholars that endorse the idea that this particular component of Christianity was influenced by these older Egyptian myths and rituals. But a lot of those quotes that I found in my research, they predate Zeitgeist. Yeah. And then you'll find some of these same authors after Zeitgeist, they're a lot more outspokenly critical of pagan parallel thesis and of drawing parallels between Christianity and earlier cultures, whereas before Zeitgeist, they were a lot more open to that idea in their works. For instance, like Eric Hornung and Jan Osman, these are world-renowned Egyptologists, and I found a lot of little snippets here, like in some of their books that aren't focused on Christianity versus Egyptian religion. There will be a few hints here and there, a few statements here and there from Dr. Hornung or Dr. Osman that say, like, this is a lot like in Christianity where this happened, where I think in my book I even have a direct quote from Jan Osman where he says that, like, the Christian idea of salvation by bodily resurrection is also akin to this Pauline idea of baptism can also be found in Egypt with the dunking of the casket in the Nile and all this this kind of stuff. But another example that comes to mind, actually, that I wanted to mention was Edwin C. Krupp, and he's an astronomer. He's not an Egyptologist, but like before Zeitgeist, I have several of his books over here on my shelf, and there are a handful of moments in each of his books where he'll point out a parallel between the Osirian cult and a component of Christianity. But after Zeitgeist, and especially after he had a run-in online with Dorothy Murdoch, he suddenly became very antagonistic towards the pagan parallel thesis.
Okay. Well, that's the thing. If you're a professional academic, your reputation is your lifeblood. It's your ability to feed your family and put a roof over your head. It's everything. I think Dr. Robert Price couldn't get work. Despite his extraordinary knowledge. And there's no shortage of extremists in universities touting really radical, extreme ideology, but there are certain views that you just can't get published, and you can't get a job at if you espouse them. And so, if you're an academic, you've got to think about your future. You've got to think, well, what am I going to be able to earn an income? And how am I going to feed my family? How am I going to make a good career? And reality is everybody everybody has to earn money. And if you're going to spend 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years studying something, and in America, your university degrees, courses cost an absolute arm and a leg, from my understanding. It's much cheaper here in Australia, though not as much as it used to be. But even if you're in Australia, if you study for 10 years, you're going to have to think about earning a good living. If you're in America and you come out of your studies with basically a mortgage, you got the same debt as if you'd bought a house. You've got to think very seriously about how am I going to pay that off, and then get into the clear, and provide for myself, and then be able to retire one day and live well. And so you have to think about the politics of your field and the environment in which you're in. How is particular views received by others? Am I going to be able to get a job if I talk about what I think about this? I think Richard Carrier was one of the people that said that when he asked academics in the field, off the record, they were quite sympathetic to his views, but they weren't willing to go on the record endorsing him, because they had to think about their careers.
Yeah, I can totally believe that. I think that's one of the flaws in the Western mindset of what you talk about with our compartmentalization and our very reductionist way of doing things, and how we've set up the systems of peer review and the scientific method and critical thinking and all these systems of checks and balances that we have in place. Ironically, I think we put too much faith, for lack of a better word, in this system, and that we think it makes us immune to our own bias.
Yes.
And actually quite the opposite is true, because these systems themselves were formulated by humans with bias.
Absolutely. You just put it in a nutshell. They very concisely said something I say myself all the time, is that people that are very much into critical thinking and reason often make the mistake of thinking themselves to be immune to the very things that they're critical in others. They don't realize that they themselves as human beings have those same traits. And all of us as human beings, we're all blind to our own problems. We can look at anyone else around us. We can say, oh, these are your problems. If I was in your shoes, I'd fix my life by doing this, 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 and this. But you can't do it with yourself. And everyone else can see your problems. Everyone else can see how you could fix your problems. Everyone else can see how you could move forward in your life and resolve your issues, but you can't see it in yourself. It's the same thing. If only we can kind of step back from our own, because we're all so close to our own perspectives. We're also, so tight with our own biases. If only we can put them aside and step back and look at ourselves in context and say, well, what are we holding on to too tightly? Now, before we finish this conversation, just want to bring back a few little points. So I've done a little bit of researching and writing myself, not anywhere near as much as what you've done on this subject. I've spoken more about spirituality and religion in general, but I did write an article on the arguments against the Pagan parallel thesis and why they're all wrong. And it really is quite extraordinary how profoundly bad the attempts to write off this thesis are. If you look at arguments against the Pagan parallel thesis, both by Christian apologists and by historicists, they're really terrible. They really haven't made any sincere attempt to approach the subject properly, and to really look at what we're saying and what we're arguing, and look at what our evidence is, and to engage with us. Like, I feel that like you as a perfect example have made a very sincere attempt to engage with your opponents. You've made every attempt to leave no stone unturned, to look at what they're saying and to respond to them honestly and accurately. You've gone out there, you found, okay, what are critics saying? How do I respond to them? And you've done it properly. I don't feel that they've done the same back to us at all. They've just tried to dismiss us in the same way that other subjects, let's say the example of UFOs can, many people will just dismiss it out of hand and laugh about it and just say that if you believe in it, you must be stupid, or you're an idiot, you're just a crackpot. The same kind of dismissal is directed towards this subject. There's not a sincere attempt to engage with it. It's just, they try to make it like, you don't want to be associated with us because you're an idiot if you are, so don't even bother going down that route.
Yeah, it's a strange spot to be in, because I've noticed that people who do get involved in the conversation about pagan parallels, it tends to take on one of two extremes on either side of the fence, which is that either you get involved in the discussion because you're a Christian and you're trying to defend the uniqueness of your faith, and so that comes with obviously very antagonistic bias right there. And then on the other hand, if it does manage to get through to you and it contributes to your deconversion, well, that's it. You're done. Like, okay, you convinced me Christianity is not unique, so I need to reassess, my involvement in it. And if it manages to help someone deconvert, like, that's it. It's no longer relevant to their lives. So it's like, okay, well, whatever. And so they have no incentive to prove the thesis. They got their usefulness out of it and they walk away from it. It's just a handful of people like, yourself and myself and the other names you mentioned throughout this episode, who I guess for our, unique set of circumstances in life have brought us to this point where we've got a lot personally invested in getting this information out there because of the impact it's had on our own lives.
Yeah.
And we don't see anyone else taking up the mantle. We it's almost like an inverse, like Saul to Paul conversion here, where we converted from Paul back into Saul, where it's like in this anti-Damascus, journey, where it's hard to find, once people deconvert from their childhood faith, it's hard to get them to take up a new cause with that same kind of fervor and passion that they tried to proselytize their former religion.
Okay.
Christians are dedicated to spreading their faith and defending their faith.
Yeah.
Skeptics are not dedicated to, defending skepticism,
Yeah, I liked, just want to pinpoint one little point you made that's so important, that it's really why it's so hard to get through to people on this subject. No matter how good your evidence is, no matter how good your arguments are, you're talking about something. If a Christian was to take seriously what we're saying here, it can mean their deconversion. That's a huge thing. I mean, and if you're a Christian and you believe your eternal life, your life in heaven after you die, and the life of all those you love after you die is dependent upon your faith, that's a humongous thing for people to accept. And Christians, Christian apologetics covers many topics. One of those is that they tend to paint other religions and other spiritual philosophies in the worst possible light. So if you're a conservative Christian, you've generally been taught that Christianity is the only option, the only spiritual option, that every other religion isn't an option, and they'll give you a list of reasons why. And that's something that I've put a lot of my time into. That's something that kind of more my special kind of field that I've tried to work on. But yeah, so if you're a Christian and someone comes to you and he says, here's evidence and reasons why your belief in Jesus can't be literally true, a Christian doesn't usually think, okay, well, maybe I could still believe in God and accept what this person is presenting to me. They generally go, well, this is just, if what this person is saying is true, my entire life is a waste of time. I've actually had a family member, say to me, are you telling me I've wasted my life? And I wasn't saying that to them. This is a family member who I love and respect and admire. I'm just saying that some of these beliefs that you hold aren't true, but they take it, it's earth-shattering to them. So this is something that really shatters people's core beliefs about what is real and what is important. And that's why it's so hard to get through on this. And even people like Bart Ehrman, who aren't Christians, I think a lot of a lot of people who are raised in Christian families and then deconvert, they still hold something really sacred about it. It's hard to get through.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned Bart Ehrman in particular, and that like this whole idea of, are you telling me I've been wrong this whole time? I think that's one thing that keeps Ehrman dedicated to taking the historicist path, even though we have seen him over time since he published that book in 2012 on the historicity of Jesus. We have seen him become more and more open to mythicist arguments and the mythicist perspective, even though he isn't fully on board with it. But I think his inability to fully get on board with it and to let go of the historicist perspective is because I think his career is made, to the point you mentioned earlier of like, how am I going to feed my family? I don't think Bart Ehrman is ever going to be hurting for a job within his field. He's made a name for himself. He's established himself as a verified scholar. So I don't think he would be hurting for work if he ever changed his perspective on this matter. However, he would still have to admit that his previous books were wrong to some degree or another. And I think that point of pride is more than he's willing to let go of.
Yeah. Look, there's a lot more I wanted to discuss in this interview, and a lot more we could discuss, but we've gone on for nearly 2 hours already. So I think we've covered enough ground for today. So I want to close by thanking you for joining me today and conversing with me. Just for anybody that probably anybody that's reading or listening that doesn't know, we've been Neil and I have been friends online for a long time. We've never met in person. He's in America, I'm in Australia. We've never met in person, but we've been friends online for a long time. So we've been conversing backwards and forth over probably 10 years or so, I reckon. And Neil's helped me immensely with my own writing. He kind of helped me establish a methodology and a set of standards to kind of aspire towards. So I want to thank you again today for joining me and for sharing your knowledge. And in particular to anyone that's viewing and listening, I just want to just stress again, go read his book. Go read his book. If you want to, we barely touched on the actual content of his book today. We barely scratched the surface of what's in there. Go have a look for yourself. Read it. It's freely available online. There's really no excuse to not be aware of this information, not be aware of the resources, the evidence that is presented, because it's freely available online. You can just click on the link, you can download it for free, and you can have instant access to it, and you can go back as many times as you need to. And if the nearly 1,000 pages on there is a bit overwhelming, you can start with some of the shorter blogs on his website, and just start there. And so I really want to stress to people that this is a really vital resource. It's so important to this field. If you want to have an understanding, a really legitimate understanding of the subject, you need to be aware of this information that's in this book, because even some of the experts like Richard Carrier and Bart Ehrman, they unless they've come and read his book now, there's information in his book that they haven't mentioned, they haven't referenced. There's actually a few things specifically I wanted to talk about in this interview, like the influence on Egyptian religion on the nativity narrative of Matthew. That's something that Richard Carrier, whilst I have tremendous admiration for his work, he really puts that down. And I just have to assume that he's never seen the evidence that you put forward in your book. I think if he did see your evidence, he'll probably change his tune on that. And that's maybe a conversation we can come back to another time. So I want to close by saying thank you for being here today. And thank you to anyone that's tuned in and have listened to this. So thank you.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Peace.